The cemetery sat on the edge of town, a place people tried not to think about, even though everyone knew it was there. Rows of crooked stones leaned against each other like tired shoulders, their carvings faded by rain and time. At night, the iron gate rattled in the wind, and those who lived nearby swore the ground shifted when no one was watching. But during the day, it seemed ordinary enough, a quiet resting place that blended into the rhythm of small-town life. Children walked past it on their way to school. The old caretaker, a man whose face was as worn as the stone he tended, made his rounds with a slow limp, pretending not to hear the whispers of those who pitied him. Life in this town moved at its own careful pace. Families had lived here for generations, tied together by blood, history, and grudges that never seemed to fade. People nodded politely when they passed on the street, but conversations carried an edge, as though everyone held something back. At the diner, where the smell of fried food clung to the air, locals gathered to talk about small victories, small losses, and rumors that always stretched longer than the truth. On Sundays, the church bell rang out clear and strong, calling people to worship, even if half of them only came to be seen. The town itself seemed trapped in time. Wooden houses with peeling paint lined the narrow streets, their porches sagging under the weight of years. Old cars sat rusting in driveways, while the newer models belonged to the families who had managed to escape poverty and still chose to come back. Money had a way of shaping the order here. Some lived by scraping just enough together to keep food on the table, while others held power in quiet, crushing ways, their wealth hidden behind fences and polite smiles. Among the townspeople were those whose names everyone knew but rarely spoke aloud. A man with influence in business who could make or break someone with a phone call. A woman who held her family together so tightly it seemed suffocating. A son who carried a weight no child should ever bear. They looked ordinary from the outside, their lives folded neatly into the fabric of the town, but there was always something in their eyes, a flicker of fear, anger, or desire, that suggested more was hidden beneath. The cemetery tied them together in ways they didn't always admit. For some, it was a place of mourning, where they returned year after year with flowers. For others, it was a reminder of secrets they wanted to bury but couldn't. The ground there felt unsettled, as if it refused to keep what was placed in it. Graves collapsed too soon, coffins shifted, and more than once, families complained that the earth had spat something back. The caretaker brushed these things off as the work of roots and rain, but whispers spread that the dead did not rest here the way they should. In the weeks leading up to everything unraveling, life seemed almost normal. Children still laughed in the schoolyard. The church choir still sang. People still gathered in their living rooms to watch the evening news, shaking their heads at tragedies that felt far away. Yet beneath this thin layer of cowl, cracks were spreading, quiet arguments behind closed doors, letters torn up and thrown into the fire, sleepless nights filled with dread that could not be named. Power played a silent role in these lives. Some held it with money, others with fear, and still others with secrets they threatened to expose. It sat in living rooms, in boardrooms, in bedrooms, creeping into decisions both small and devastating. It shaped the way parents spoke to their children, the way husbands looked at their wives, and the way neighbors turned away instead of asking questions. The town's politeness was only a cover. Beneath it, there was resentment, jealousy, and a hunger for control. The people who would soon be at the center of it all lived as though everything was fine. They laughed at family dinners. They smiled at church. They waved across the street. But there was tension in the way one lingered too long at a grave, in the way another avoided eye contact when someone asked where they had been. There were unspoken rules, boundaries no one dared to cross, and yet something in the air suggested they would soon be broken. At night, when the town grew quiet and the wind passed through the cemetery gates, shadows stretched across the stones like long fingers. Dogs barked at nothing, their cries sharp and unsettled. The caretaker swore he heard footsteps where no one should be. It was as if the ground itself was waiting, restless and unwilling to keep its dead. And in the middle of it all, hidden behind everyday smiles and routines, were people on the edge of choices that would change everything. They didn't know yet that the fragile balance of their lives was about to collapse. But the signs were there. If anyone had dared to look closely enough, the first cracks in their lives showed up quietly, like hairline fractures in glass. At first, no one paid much attention. A sharp word at the dinner table, a door closed harder than it should have been, a night spin apart without explanation. These were the kinds of things families shrugged off, convincing themselves it was nothing more than stress or fatigue. But beneath the surface, resentment was building. One evening, at the diner where most of the town's gossip was born, eyes followed a man who walked in alone. He should have been with his family, but instead he sat by himself, shoulders tense, staring too long at the waitress who refilled his coffee. His absence at home was noticed and whispered about. His wife felt the sting of it every time someone asked where he was, their faces pretending curiosity, but their voices dripping with judgment. She began to carry herself differently, her smile strained, her words shorter, as if she was running out of ways to hold things together. Money played its part, too. For some, it was the constant worry of bills piling up, the quiet shame of borrowing from neighbors, the humiliation of asking for extensions they knew they couldn't pay back. For others, wealth gave them the illusion of control, but so created enemies. Promises were made and broken behind closed doors, loans exchanged with the kind of interest that went beyond numbers. Resentment grew in silence, sitting at kitchen tables and in late-night arguments, waiting for a spark to set it off. There were secrets, too. One of the men carried one, so heavy it seeped into his every move. At night, when his wife asked why he was awake, he blamed work, but the truth was that he could still hear the echo of a voice from years ago, one that belonged to someone who should have been long gone. A mistake he thought he had buried refused to stay buried, rising in flashes of memory when he least expected it. In the cemetery, he sometimes stood at a grave no one else visited, his lips moving as though confessing, his eyes darting over his shoulder to make sure no one saw. The caretaker had noticed. He saw more than people thought, moving slowly among the graves, pretending to focus on the weeds. He watched the visitors with eyes sharpened by years of silence. He saw the woman who pressed her hands too tightly to the earth, her tears angry instead of sorrowful. He saw the son who lingered at a headstone late into the night, his fists clenched as if the ground itself had wronged him. He never spoke of these things, but he carried them like stones in his chest, each one weighing heavier as time passed. One night, the air between a husband and wife broke open into shouting that could be heard through the thin walls of their home. Neighbors later said they heard glass shatter, though no one stepped in. In towns like this, people pretended not to notice, telling themselves it wasn't their business. But they remembered, and they whispered. The woman who once kept her hair neat and her voice calm now walked through town with shadows under her eyes and bruises she didn't bother to hide. She had stopped pretending everything was fine. Jealousy spread like fire. A man began following his wife's every move, convinced she was hiding something. He checked her phone, her letters, her bags, his anger tightening every time he found nothing. Another woman, tired of being ignored, started confiding in someone she shouldn't have, someone who promised to listen, but whose attention came at a dangerous cost. Lines blurred between comfort and betrayal until trust was no longer possible. The church, once a place where people came for peace, became a stage where power was displayed. Families sat in their polished clothes, smiles painted on, while the preacher's words cut into them in ways they couldn't admit. Sermons about loyalty, sin, and truth left some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, as though their private battles had been dragged into the open. Erward, in the churchyard, conversations carried undertones sharper than the words themselves. Past grievances resurfaced. Two brothers who hadn't spoken in years found themselves in the same room, the air between them thick with unspoken history. One blamed the other for something that had happened long ago, something involving a night that ended with blood and silence. Though no one dare bring it up, the memory was still alive, gnawing at both of them. Their handshake at a family gathering was stiff their smiles tight, but the tension hung heavy enough for everyone to feel. The son who had once been quiet and obedient began to change. His teachers noticed his distraction, the way his handwriting grew messy, his eyes unfocused. At home, he slammed doors, disappeared for hours, and came back smelling of smoke. His mother tried to reach him, but he pulled further away, his anger simmering beneath the surface. He knew things he wasn't supposed to know, secrets whispered through walls, arguments half heard at night. It twisted inside him until the boy who once laughed freely now looked at his family with eyes that seemed too old for his age. The cemetery became a meeting place, though no one called it that. People found themselves drawn there at odd hours, standing among the stones as though searching for something. Arguments were carried out in hushed voices near graves that had already seen too much grief. Promises were made there, desperate ones, binding people together in ways they couldn't easily escape. The caretaker watched, his unease growing. He had tended this ground for decades, but never before had he felt it pulse with so much unrest. The turning point came on a night when the town seemed restless. The wind howled through the streets, rattling shutters and carrying voices further than they should have gone. In one house, a father struck the table so hard his plate shattered, sending his family into silence. In another, a woman packed a bag, her hands trembling, though she never made it to the door. In yet another, two men sat across from each other, their words polite but laced with threats, the kind that left no room for misunderstanding. These were not explosions, but the result of slow, grinding pressure that had been building for months, even years. Each lie told, each secret kept, each betrayal ignored had layered upon the last, until the weight was unbearable. By now, the town itself seemed to feel it, the way dogs barked more at night, the way children hesitated before walking past certain houses, the way silence lingered longer after conversations. And through it all, the cemetery loomed, restless and waiting. The ground seemed to heave when it rained, as if rejecting the bodies it had been forced to keep. Families noticed the earth shifting over the graves, flowers falling out of place, soil sinking where it shouldn't. It was as if the dead themselves were unsettled, their unrest reflecting the turmoil of the living, and one could say when exactly it all began to tip. But the descent was clear. The town had become a place where smiles hid threats, where families tore at each other in secret, and where every decision seemed to push someone closer to breaking. What had once been a fragile peace was gone, replaced by a quiet war inside homes and hearts. The lines between victim and perpetrator blurred, and the closer they came to the inevitable moment, the harder it was to tell who held the most to lose. That tea happened on a night when the air itself felt heavy, pressing down on the town like a warning. The wind had died, and with it came an unsettling stillness, as though the world was holding its breath. Inside the house at the edge of town, shadows stretched long across the walls, broken only by the flicker of a single lamp. The family sat around the table, but there was no warmth, no conversation, only the brittle silence of people who had run out of ways to pretend. The father's hands trembled as he gripped his glass, the liquid inside barely touched. His wife sat stiffly across from him, her eyes darkened with the weight of words she had swallowed for too long. The son leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a bitter smirk tugging at his lips as though daring someone to speak. It was all there, the jealousy, the resentment, the secrets, boiling in the room like smoke waiting for a spark. The argument began the way it always did, with a small spark of accusation. The father asked where she had been earlier that day, his voice sharp, his eyes narrowing. She answered calmly at first, her voice steady, but her hands fidgeted in her lap. The boy let out a laugh, low and mocking, and that sound alone was enough to make his father snap. He slammed his hand against the table, the lamp shaking, shadows jumping wildly against the walls. What followed was chaos, voices overlapping, accusations thrown like knives. Years of buried rage came spilling out all at once. Every betrayal, every lie, every moment of humiliation. The mother stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, her face flushed with fury. She shouted words she had never dared to say aloud, calling him out for things she had hidden to protect their family's name. The boy stood, too, his fists clenched, finally voicing the secrets he had overheard late at night. The debts, the threats, the shame that had been kept from him. The father's face twisted, torn between rage and fear. His hand went to the drawer by the table, the one everyone knew held more than silverware. His wife froze, her breath catching, her mind racing as she realized what he was reaching for. The boy shouted, lunged forward, trying to stop him, but everything moved too quickly. The sound shattered the night. A single, sharp crack that echoed through the walls, across the yard, and out into the still streets. For a moment, there was nothing, no breath, no movement, just the acrid smell of smoke and the ringing silence that follows destruction. Then came the screams. The wife's cry tore through the air, raw and broken, as she dropped to her knees beside her son. Blood spread across the floorboards, dark and thick, pooling around hands that had once held schoolbooks and laughter. The father stood frozen, the gun still warm in his GR. His chest heaving. His eyes darted from his wife to his son, then back again, as though trying to wake from a nightmare. His mind raced. He hadn't meant for it to happen like this. He wanted control, not this. He wanted silence, not death. But the weight of what he had done crashed over him, pressing the air from his lungs. His wife turned on him then, her face twisted with a rage he had never seen before. She screamed words that cut deeper than any weapon, her grief spilling into hatred. She struck at him with her fists, her nails clawing, her sobs choking her. He tried to speak, to defend himself, to claim it had been an accident, but the words died in his throat. Nothing could undo what had been done. The boy's breathing was shallow, ragged, fading with each passing second. His mother cradled him, rocking as though she could hold him back from the edge, whispering promises he could no longer hear. She pressed her hands against the wound, desperate, begging, but her voice cracked with the weight of the truth she could not admit. He was slipping away, in those final moments. The boy's eyes fluttered open, meeting his father's. There was no forgiveness in them, only something colder, something final. The father staggered back, his stomach twisting, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to reach out, to beg, but his legs felt rooted to the floor. He could only watch as the life drained from his son's eyes, leaving behind a silence that would haunt him forever. The immediate aftermath was chaos in its own quiet way. The mother refused to let go, her arms wrapped so tightly around her son's body that her knuckles turned white. Her sobs filled the room, echoing off the walls like a dirge. The father stumbled back against the wall, the gun slipping from his hand and clattering to the floor. He stared at the blood, at the red spreading across the floorboards, and his mind went blank. Panic clawed at him, but denial was louder. He muttered to himself, "It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to happen." Then came the desperation. He reached for her, tried to pull her up, trying to force her to see reason. "We can't tell anyone," he whispered harshly, his voice trembling. "No one has to know." But she wrenched herself away from him, her face pale, her eyes wild with disbelief. Her screams grew sharper, fueled not just by grief, but by fury, as she realized he cared more about hiding what he had done than about the life he had taken. The room became unbearable. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. Every second stretched on endlessly, each breath a reminder of the irreversible act. The father paced, his hands shaking, his mind racing with half-formed plans. The mother clung to her son's body, refusing to let the truth of death settle over her. The crime had shattered more than a family. It had broken the fragile illusion of control, exposing the rot beneath their lives. In that moment, none of them was who they had once been. The father was no longer a man of authority, but a murderer. The mother was no longer a protector, but a witness to the destruction of everything she had fought to hold together. And the boy, once a child with dreams, was now a ghost, a silence that would linger in every corner of that house. The night dragged on, filled with sobs, muttered denials, and the Cree. Ping realization that nothing could be undone. The crime was complete, the blood would not wash away, and the ground outside, restless and waiting, would soon demand its due. The morning after the crime, the house felt hollow, as if every wall had absorbed the screams from the night before. The floorboards still carried the stain, dark and heavy, impossible to ignore. The mother hadn't moved for hours. She stayed on the ground, her arms wrapped around her son's body long after his chest had stopped rising. Her hair hung loose, her eyes red and swollen, her skin pale from the weight of grief that drained the life from her. No words came, no prayers, just the low sound of her breathing and the occasional sob that broke through when silence became unbearable. The father moved like a ghost. His shirt was still streaked with blood, his hands trembling even after he had scrubbed them raw at the sink. The water ran pink, then clear, but he couldn't wash away the feeling that his son's blood was still there, clinging to his skin. He muttered to himself as he paced, fragments of denial spilling out. It was an accident. He lunged. He made me do it. His words shifted from justification to guilt and back again, as though he was trying to rewrite the memory in his own head. The town awoke unaware of what had happened in that house. Neighbors went about their mornings, children rushing off to school, farmers heading to their fields, the church bell ringing in the distance. But when the mother's wail finally pierced the quiet, carried out through the open window, it spread like a siren call. One by one, faces appeared in doorways, whispers began, and before long, the truth started to leak out. By the time the sheriff arrived, the story had already begun to twist. Some said the father had been drinking. Others swore the boy had threatened him first. A few whispered that the mother had known it was coming, that she had turned a blind eye to his temper for too long. Gossip traveled faster than facts, and before the body was even taken from the house, the family's name was being picked apart piece by piece. The mother refused to leave with the coroner. She fought them, screamed at them, begged them not to take her son away. When they finally pried her fingers from his body, she collapsed, her cries turning to silence, her body limp with exhaustion. People in the crowd looked away, some out of pity, others out of shame, as if by witnessing her grief they had been complicit in her suffering. The father stood apart, his face blank, his eyes unfocused. Some saw guilt there, others saw nothing at all, a hollow man who had crossed a line that could never be undone. The sheriff's hand on his arm pulled him from his daze, and when the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, there was a collective intake of breath from the crowd. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He only lowered his head as he was led away, his reputation crumbling with each step. In the days that followed, the town could speak of nothing else. At the diner, people leaned close across tables, their voices hushed but sharp. At the church, sermons turned heavy with warnings of sin and punishment, as though the crime had stained the whole community. Neighbors who once smiled at the family now crossed the street to avoid the mother. Their discomfort cloaked in pity they couldn't express aloud. The mother withdrew from the world. She locked herself in her home, curtains drawn, phone unanswered. Friends came with food, flowers, and prayers, but she sent them away. She couldn't bear the sound of their voices, the looks in their eyes that said they saw her not as who she was, but as the woman who had lost her child in the most violent way imaginable. She replayed that night endlessly, every scream, every word, every second she wished she had done differently. Guilt clung to her, whispering that she could have stopped it, that she should have left long before it happened. The father sat in his cell, the weight of silence crushing him. At first, he tried to convince himself he had acted in self-defense, that the gun had gone off in a moment of panic. But when the lights went out and he was left alone with nothing but his thoughts, the truth pressed against him like chains. He saw his son's eyes in the dark, staring at him, accusing, unblinking. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to shut out the sound of the shot that still rang in his head, but nothing could quiet it. Sleep became impossible, food tasteless, and time meaningless. The trial drew attention far beyond the town. Reporters came, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in faces. Headlines painted him as a monster, a violent man whose temper had finally destroyed his own family. Others tried to spin him as a broken father, a man crushed by financial and personal strain, whose mistake had cost him everything. The truth was more complicated, but no one wanted complicated. The world wanted villains and victims, and lines were drawn quickly. For the community, it was a reckoning. Some saw the crime as a reflection of the hidden violence they had long ignored in their neighbors' homes. Others insisted it was an isolated tragedy, something that could never happen to them. But whispers spread of other arguments heard through thin walls, of other bruises hidden beneath sleeves, of other secrets the town had chosen not to see. The crime had cracked open a door, forcing them to face things they had long buried. The boy's absence was felt everywhere. His empty desk at school, his missing voice in the choir, the unfinished drawings left behind in his room. Friends left flowers and letters at his grave, their handwriting shaky, their words filled with questions they couldn't bring themselves to ask aloud. His teachers struggled with guilt, wondering if they had missed signs in his behavior, or if they had failed him. His absence was not just a silence, but a wound that stretched far beyond his home. The mother carried her grief like a weight she could never set down. She visited the cemetery every day, kneeling at the grave as though speaking to her son could undo what had been done. She stopped speaking of her husband altogether, her silence sharper than any words she could have said. Her love for her son remained, but it was twisted now with anger, regret, and the haunting knowledge that she would never forgive herself for not protecting him. The father faced the court, his face gaunt, his voice weak. When asked if he regretted what he had done, he broke down for the first time, sobbing uncontrollably, his words tangled with apologies no one believed. The jury watched, the town watched, the world watched. But for the mother, no apology could erase the image burned in her mind, the sound of that single shot tearing their lives apart. The aftermath lingered long after the trial ended, long after the cameras left. The cemetery, restless as ever, now held a boy whose life had been stolen by the very hands that should have protected him. For the family, there was no healing, only survival. For the town, there was no forgetting, only a silence that weighed heavier with each passing day. The crime had torn apart more than a home. It had torn apart the illusion that people were safe within their walls. And for those who remained, every passing glance at the cemetery gates, every whisper of wind through the iron bars, was a reminder that some wounds never close and some truths never rest. The verdict came on a gray morning, when the sky hung low over the courthouse as if mirroring the weight of what was about to be decided. The father stood before the judge, thinner than he had ever been, his face lined not only by age but by sleepless nights and the constant gnawing of guilt. His suit hung loose on his frame, and when the charges were read aloud, murder, reckless endangerment, unlawful possession, he barely seemed to react. Perhaps he had already sentenced himself in the long hours alone with his thoughts, or perhaps he had stopped believing anything mattered. The jury found him guilty. Some in the community said it was justice. Others whispered that no verdict could ever truly pay for what had been lost. When the judge handed down his years of imprisonment, the courtroom filled with a silence thicker than any protest. The father lowered his head, his lips trembling as though he wanted to say something, an apology, a plea, anything, but no words came. He was led away in chains, his footsteps echoing through the hall, each one closing the door on the man he once had been. For the mother, the verdict brought no peace. She sat in the courtroom, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned W. Height. She listened to every word, watched every face, but felt nothing but the hollow ache of loss. The man she had once loved, the man she had built her life beside, was gone, not just to prison, but to the darker place his own choices had dragged him. And the boy she had loved more than anything would never return. Justice, in the cold language of law, had been served. But to her, there was no justice in any of it. There was only survival. The town moved on in its own way, but scars remained. The family's name, once spoken with a mix of respect and envy, was now tainted. People who once shared meals and laughter with them now avoided eye contact when a mother passed on the street. Children whispered at school, repeating the fragments of gossip they had overheard at home. The house where it had happened stood empty for months, its windows boarded up, its walls too full of memory for anyone to claim. Neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past it, as though the very air around it was cursed. The cemetery, restless as always, held its silence. The boy's grave became a place where flowers were left by strangers, some out of pity, others out of guilt. His name, etched in stone, was a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the violence that had ended it. The caretaker tended the ground with a heavier heart, his eyes lingering on that one grave longer than the rest. For him, it was not just another name on earth. It was the story of a family torn apart, of secrets unburied, of grief that could never be healed. The media's fascination faded eventually, as it always does. Reporters moved on to fresher tragedies. Headlines shifted to new scandals, but the community remained marked by what had happened. The story lingered not in newspapers, but in the quiet conversations over coffee, in the cautious glances exchanged at church, in the hesitations of parents who wondered what hidden battles might exist in their neighbors' homes. In the broader sense, the crime forced people to face uncomfortable truths. For years, the father had been respected, his temper dismissed as stress, his silence excused as pride. The mother's sadness had been noticed, but never questioned, her bruises hidden behind explanations that people chose to believe. The boy's change in behavior had been brushed aside as typical rebellion. No one wanted to see what was right in front of them, and when the truth finally broke open, it demanded more than shock. It demanded reflection. Questions about morality and power whispered through the town. How much did wealth and reputation shield a man until the violence could no longer be ignored? How often had neighbors turned away, telling themselves it wasn't their place to interfere? What responsibility did a community carry for the secrets it allowed to fester? These were questions without simple answers, but they hung in the air like smoke refusing tea. Oh, clear. For the mother, life became something quieter, smaller. She rarely left her home, and when she did, her steps were slow, her head lowered. She spoke little, her voice hoarse from the grief that had hollowed her out. But in her silence, there was also a kind of strength, a determination to endure even if she could not heal. She lived not for herself, but as a witness to what had been lost, carrying her son's memory in every breath. The father's life in prison was one of slow decay. He became a shadow among shadows, a man haunted by the face of his child every time he closed his eyes. Some said he prayed endlessly. Others said he stared blankly at the walls, unresponsive to the world around him. In the eyes of many, his punishment was not the years given by the judge, but the unrelenting torment of memory. No bars could be stronger than the prison he carried inside. And so, the story came to rest, not with resolution, but with reflection. A boy gone too soon, a mother broken, a father condemned, and a town forced to confront the lies it had told itself for too long. The tragedy revealed the fragility of the human heart, the dangers of unchecked power, and the silence that allows darkness to grow. In the end, the cemetery that refused to keep its dead became not just a place of burial, but a symbol. It reminded everyone that secrets cannot stay buried forever, that the past has a way of rising, and that no matter how tightly people cling to appearances, the truth will demand to be seen. The question of justice remained complicated. The law had done its part, but no sentence could return what had been taken. The mother would carry her grief until her last breath. The father would wither away under the weight of his own choices. The town would live on with the uneasy knowledge that tragedy is never as far away as it seems. Perhaps the only truth left was this: human beings are fragile, capable of love and cruelty in equal measure, and when power, pride, and silence converge, even the strongest bonds can shatter. The boy's grave stood as a reminder, not just of a life lost, but of everything buried with him: trust, innocence, and the illusion of safety. And in the quiet nights, When the wind moved through the iron gates of the cemetery, those who lived nearby swore they could hear it. The echo of a boy's laughter carried on the air, refusing to be silenced. A reminder that even in death, the truth does not rest.